Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name's Sarah. I just wanted to let you know before we start that there will be an opportunity to ask questions to Erin at the end of the talk. And if you have questions as we go along, feel free to type them in the chat box and I will collect those to read that out to Erin at the end. So Erin is the Georgian Bay Land Trust Protected Areas Manager. And in his spare time, he's also a keen birder and naturalist. And last summer, he spearheaded two new bird research programs with the Land Trust, one on whippoorwills and the other, which he'll be talking about tonight, on prairie warblers. And Erin's going to give us tonight a brief overview of the results of last year, as well as the questions we're hoping to answer going forward. So over to you, Erin.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. Let's see if I can make this work properly. I'll just share my screen and maybe I may have to switch it. Is this the full screen view?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect. So my talk today is on a species that is very near and dear to me and probably a large number of other cottagers in Georgian Bay, which is the prairie warbler. Here's a nice full screen view of what a prairie warbler looks like for those of you who maybe have heard it singing most likely at your cottage, but maybe not paid enough attention to see it hopping through the junipers. They're really quite a neat species and fairly restricted to Georgian Bay when they're breeding in Ontario. So a little bit about me. I know Sarah's already kind of given you an overview, so I won't spend too much time on this, but I am the Protected Areas Manager with the Georgian Bay Land Trust, very avid naturalist and birder. I like to use the term avid. I have heard myself referred to as obsessive, but avid has a nicer ring to it. I bird pretty much all the time. If I'm, especially in May, I'm waking up, usually at 5 or 6 in the morning to go birding before work, and then working, and then birding after work. So I like to spend a lot of my spare time birding. And then in July and August, when the birds quiet down and they're busy with nest building, I tend to switch to other naturalism. So I do a lot of work with odonates, which is like dragonflies and damselflies. I do work with butterflies, and then a lot with aquatics. So I'm quite experienced with a large variety of different species at risk. Interestingly enough, the prairie warbler is not a species at risk in Ontario, and I'm going to talk about a little bit later why this is such an interesting observation that they're not a species at risk. But I also do a lot of work with herpetofauna through my work with GBLT and other kind of provincially significant plants and animals. So about prairie warblers. So again, here's another prairie warbler. They're one of Ontario's rarest breeding warblers. I'm not going to say they're the rarest because often we have like these really random kind of one or two breeding of like some really obscure warbler. So I think sometimes we have like Kentucky warblers that manage to breed in Ontario. Southern Ontario is the north end of a lot of warblers ranges. So sometimes they kind of trickle into Ontario and attempt to breed. So prairie warblers are probably not technically the rarest breeding warbler, but they probably are one of the rarest breeding warblers that regularly occurs in Ontario. It's a very interesting species because there's so few of them around Ontario, and most of them are found in Georgian Bay. So we have about 400 breeding pairs in Ontario. You can recognize them by this really kind of trilling song they do. Most people maybe north of Beausoleil Island have probably heard it outside their cottage. They love coastal environments, seem to be found only along the coast of Georgian Bay, and this ascending trill that they give throughout the day. The other diagnostic feature is this black semicircle under their eye. So you can see this kind of half moon under their eye, as well as a brown patch on their back. So they'll have this really nice brown patch, which you'll see in some of the other photos. And then they're one of the few warblers that actually pumps their tail. So you can see them bobbing their tail a lot when they're moving around the bushes. The only other warbler that commonly does that is the palm warbler, and they don't breed in Georgian Bay, or they don't breed in southern portions of Georgian Bay. So it's a kind of unique warbler and often overlooked because of its size. It's quite small, it's quite loud, But if you're not looking for it, you may not be able to find it. This one was nice enough to perch outside my cottage, and I like to have a coffee every morning and sit on the porch. And often when I'm doing that, a prairie warbler will kind of make its way along our junipers, do a couple quick songs, and then move along. So there is that special attachment. I think when I think of Georgian Bay, I think of prairie warblers. So here's their actual breeding range. And this is what I think is quite unique and interesting about prairie warblers, in that this Georgian Bay population right here is just this really small population strictly along the coast of Georgian Bay. We also have, and I'll maybe X these a little bit so they're more noticeable, we have a population down near Prairie Provincial Park, and then we have this population in the Frontenac. The Frontenac population appears to be restricting its range. There were a far more breeding in past years than there have been seen this year. There's still a good amount of them, but about 80% of the breeding population is found in Georgian Bay. So despite this kind of really small marker around Georgian Bay, that is 80% of our Ontario's breeding population. I think in Pinery, there's really only like less than 5 pairs, and Frontenac has around somewhere between 50 and 80 pairs, at least last breeding bird atlas. And then Georgian Bay has around 300. I think some estimates get us all the way up to 400, but really quite restricted. When you think about something like the Canada warbler, which is a species at risk, it's an at-risk warbler, and there's something like 1.2 million of them that breed up in the boreal forest, compared to the 400 breeding pairs, so 800 birds that we might have for prairie warblers on Ontario. I find it very interesting that prairie warblers are not a species at risk in Ontario when there's so few of them, and there are other birds with much larger populations and much less restricted habitat that are actually identified as species at risk. So very limited in breeding range, and not a lot is known about their composition of their habitat. So what's really interesting about this states population, so all these in kind of the more southern states, they breed in a much different habitat than what we see in Georgian Bay. So Georgian Bay is this shoreline habitat, coastal rock barrens, early successional forest type of habitat. Whereas in the States, they breed in like shrubby thickets and like roadsides and like cedar hedges. They're a much more generalist species when they breed in the States, whereas Georgian Bay, they're restricted to our kind of shrubland barren systems. And then again, if you look at the Frontenac population, they breed in this shrubby thicket area that isn't attached to any coastline. So the Georgian Bay population is really quite unique in the habitat makeup that's required. And if you look at a place like Torrance Barrens, which is in Muskoka, quite close to Georgian Bay, they're not found in there, despite the habitat being very similar, open rock barrens, shrubland rock barrens, but just not having the same breeding population. So we don't really know a lot about what habitat size they need, what kind of plant species they might require, the classification of the ecosystems they use. There's a lot of assumptions that we make about this species in Georgian Bay. And so this project was hopefully to try to, figure out if those assumptions are correct and figure out some more of the specifics behind this species. So we had two objectives going into this project, and pictured here are myself and my research partner, Andrew Beauchamp, who's with the University of Western and has done some research with us in the past. And our objectives were to assess both the habitat requirements and territory size using short burst Motus tags, and also the migratory pathways and their migratory timing using long burst tags. Oops, sorry. The short burst and long burst tags are basically because prairie warblers are such a small bird that we actually can't put a very large Motus tag on them. They can't support a huge amount of weight. So we put just a small tag on them, which only has a very restricted battery life. So we kind of had to choose two different types of tags to meet both of these requirements, because choosing one tag would not actually give us all the data we need. So I'm going to talk about these two different short burst, long burst tags, how they're different, and how they were used for each of the objectives. But there was also a side objective, and you see a rather sad looking prairie warbler getting some of its head feathers removed here. We also collected biological samples. We collected biological samples. We collected head feathers and tail feathers. This is to help us understand a bit more about the Georgian Bay population. So these feathers can be analyzed using isotope analysis to figure out where they're growing the feathers. Each kind of latitude in Canada and the US have a specific kind of isotope that represents, the presence of elements in our ecosystem. So analyzing that can help inform it for tail feathers, where they're growing the tail feathers, i.e. their breeding grounds, and then head feathers, they grow their head feathers on their wintering ground, so it can be used to inform some of the wintering ground data. So this was just a side objective, but we included it as well because if the Georgian Bay population is a subpopulation like our Massasauga rattlesnake, there is a stronger case to be said that, this is a species at risk. It only occurs in Georgian Bay. We need to protect this, and we need additional measures to help us protect it. So that was kind of the impetus behind this also side objective. So about the Motus tagging, GBLT maintains 13 Motus tag towers along Georgian Bay. So you can see this is not necessarily all of them. We don't own every single one of these yellow dots, but these yellow dots represent a Motus tower. And these towers pick up a signal that's emitted by these tags that we put on. So the tags emit this like burst of noise that we can't hear, but is picked up by these towers. And this burst of noise has a specific signature, so we can tell which bird is flying by the tower. The neat thing about these towers is they have about a 15-kilometer range in kind of optimal conditions. And because prairie warblers are so vocal and perch so high and are out in these kind of more open habitats, we are able to pick them up fairly well on these towers. So we have a cluster of towers down in Georgian Bay. There's some moving up the coast. There's one on Sandy Island, one up on Little McCoy. There's some inland near Shawanaga, Blackstone Lake, Otter Lake, and then there's one down in Port Severn. So these are going to be tracking the movements of the birds as they move around Georgian Bay, as they migrate, but also if there's any post-breeding dispersal, if they move away from their breeding grounds at some point in the year. They can also be tracked manually. So there's an antenna that we have that picks up the signal as well. So you can basically use it to narrow down where the bird is. And with prairie warblers, often you actually just find the bird because they're so vocal and so visible that we were able to basically relocate our birds. I think it was about 90% of the time we would be able to see the singing prairie warbler. So there's a couple different tools in our arsenal to collect the data that we need. So that first objective used 15 short burst tags. And in total, we used 30 tags, which is 15 short burst, 15 long burst. And I like to say we tagged about 10% of the breeding males in Georgian Bay, which is such a huge amount. You're never going to get a scientific study, or very rarely you're going to get a scientific study that has such a representation of a given population. 10% of a population is quite a large number. So the data we're collecting is quite significant. These short burst tags were on for about 12 hours a day. They were on during the day, so we could track where they were moving on their breeding territories. So we had our summer students manually track them with that antenna, kind of located each bird's, and acquired 20 different GPS points for their tag. So these points were collected as they moved around their breeding territory, and the points will be used to determine what their actual territory size is by fitting it into a territory size model. So it's going to give us a sense of, how many acres their territories are, what kind of habitats they're using in their territories, if there's maybe a core group of territory. So that kind of is the first objective. The reason it's a 12-hour on off is because we want to be able to save as much battery life as possible. We only had about 2 months with these short burst tags on before the batteries were going to die. And the short burst tags repeat their kind of burst of noise every 7 seconds. So it's a 7 second short burst where it's kind of bursting that noise out. And the reason it's so short is because if it's too long, like if it's a minute, it's going to be very hard to track those birds down because you're waiting, a minute for each burst of noise. So if it flies away, all of a sudden it's gone and you have to re-find it and then track it again. So the 7 seconds allows us a pretty easy refinding ability as we're tracking them. So then the second objective used 15 long burst tags, and these were on-off cycles during they were on during the night. So they turned on around 5 p.m., I believe, or 6 or 7 p.m., and continued for 12 hours into the early morning. These had a 40-second on-off stage. So it was 40 seconds burst, 40 seconds, another burst. And the reason there was so much space in between these bursts is we're only really using them for migration. So when they're flying above the towers, there's plenty of time for that tower to pick up the tag, especially with a 15-kilometer range. So they're gonna pass through that tower's kind of signal range a few times in that 40 seconds. And since we're not manually tracking them, we can have a longer time period. So these ones were going to last around 4 months, 5 months until kind of they reach their wintering grounds. And this is being used to inform migratory movements and timings. We don't know if they cross across Georgian Bay when they're going south. We don't know about what time they leave Georgian Bay. It seems like it's early, but that's maybe not necessarily true if they're just being quiet. And there's so few individuals that we may just be missing them on the fall migration. So there's me holding, I believe it was our last tagged prairie warbler after the tag had been outfitted on this one. And we managed to tag, I think, about 8 birds on our last day, which was kind of a bit of a record for us because sometimes we were only getting 1 or 2 birds a day, depending on the conditions. So how do you tag a bird? This is a question I get asked quite frequently. So here's myself and one of our summer students last year, Bradley Squarick, setting up a mist net. So the first thing you do is you find a singing prairie warbler. And the reason that's all caps is because it almost certainly has to be singing. We tried to set up mist nets, and if the bird stopped singing while we were setting up the mist net, it means it moved somewhere else. Often, or I think in every single case, the bird was still singing when we set up the mist net and captured it. And if it wasn't singing when we finished setting up the mist net, we didn't capture it. So we find a singing prairie warbler, set up a mist net as quickly as we possibly can, and then we use playback to attract the bird. So basically, playback is playing its call or its song so that the male will come and investigate who's encroaching on his territory. So we start the playback and then we wait. Often the bird would fly into the net within about 2 minutes. Sometimes it was longer than that. Sometimes they figure out where the net is and they're just flying over it. There's a lot of kind of factors that go into how quickly we get the bird into the net, but usually it's 2 to 5 minutes. That usually takes that long. So here's a prairie warbler after it's hit the net. So these nets have basically this really fine mesh to not injure the bird, and the bird kind of hits the net, drops down into what we call a pocket, gets a little tangled, and then we go and extract it. So when a bird hits the net, first thing we do is sprint to ensure that it stays in the net. They're very small, and they bounce out of the net, and they can actually go through the net if they kind of wiggle enough. So this one was luckily trapped fairly well, and we didn't have to close the net to make sure it was staying in there. But we kind of sprinted often to make sure that we would get the bird out of the net because we were watching the net basically the entire time. We extract the bird. So this is Andrew actually extracting the bird from the net, and we put it in a bird bag. And despite what it looks like, most birds are or I shouldn't say incredibly, but fairly easy to extract. It just gets a loop kind of, their head goes through one of the loops in the mist net. You just untangle the wings and pull out the head. And I had one bander in charge that said every bird in a net should be removed within 1 minute. And if it's slower than that, then you just need more practice. So often they were extracted quite quickly. And then we begin data collection and Motus tagging on the bird. And usually that takes around 15 minutes. But by the end of our kind of time tagging and banding, we had got it down to about 8 minutes. So it can be quite efficient. And if you're ever doing like spring or fall migration at banding stations and they're just banding the birds, you can band something like, a bird a minute or 2 birds every minute. So often they're not getting handled for too long. Because we were doing a bit more data collection, the birds are being handled for a little bit longer, but we always are paying attention to the bird and making sure it's not getting too stressed. And if it seems like it's getting too stressed, we release it early, or we don't take a specific sample. And here is a video of one actually releasing. And what you're going to see in this video is just a little correction in its flight. It's not going to fly perfectly straight out of the hand. And that's because they need a little correction to get used to that weight of the Motus tags are something like 0.2 or 0.3 grams, but even just that small amount of weight is something that they need to get used to. So here's Andrew releasing it, and just a little correction in the flight at the start to make sure to get used to that extra weight. And if you think about it, it's not actually a ton of extra weight. Birds, when they're feeding on migration or feeding during their life cycle, they can put on like, I think I've seen a white-throated sparrow put on like 4 or 5 grams within 2 or 3 days. So their weight does fluctuate quite a lot in just the regular life cycle. So that extra 0.3 grams is actually not a huge impediment to them. And we make it that small to ensure that it's not, too heavy for them. So now I'm going to show you a video of just kind of the banding process. So this is Andrew banding one of our prairie warblers. I don't have any sound in this video. I'm just going to talk you through kind of the stages of the banding process that we do. So the first thing that happens is Andrew removing the bird from the bag. It's often not that challenging, but you get it into what's called bander's grip while it's in the bag, so that when you remove it, there's no chance of it escaping. So the very first thing we do is we put on a metal band. You open the metal band, and then you'll see him do a quarter turn right there. And that's so if the bird kicks while you're closing the band, it doesn't catch the leg when the band closes. A quarter turn allows them to kind of just kick against the band. Right now, he's aging and sexing it. So this one is a male because of the kind of black in the face. Males have this really striking black semicircle that we talked about earlier. He's also aging it. You can age the birds by the amount of white in their tail feathers, the chestnut coverts on the back, how much chestnuts in their back feathers, shape of tail feathers, shape of wing feathers. And then he does a wing chord measurements. So he is taking a measurement, a length of the wing. In some species, you can actually tell the sex by the length of the wing. Prairie warblers, it's just a useful data point to be collecting. The next thing he does is take a tarsus, which is basically like wrist to elbow in our case. That just helps us figure out what size of Motus tag might be good for the bird. It's just another measurement we can also take to assess kind of different populations. He also removes a tail feather. So he'll be taking one of the inner tail feathers, and this is for the isotope analysis. So the isotope analysis, as I talked about, that tail feather is going to inform the breeding location, so where it grew that feather the past year. He's also then removing those head feathers that I talked about. And surprisingly enough, we only take 4 feathers, and if you look at the bird afterwards, it looks like we didn't remove anything. So if you see a bird with a lot of head feathers or body feathers removed, it means that it's lost a lot of feathers. And they do lose feathers in like fights with other birds, things like that. But um, there is usually quite a large number of head and body feathers. So it's not really impactful on the bird. You can see it kind of looks like we removed nothing. And then the last step we do is weigh it. So he's going to use a weigh cone, and put the bird in the weigh cone so it can't just fly away as we're attempting to weigh it. I call it the cone of shame. Um, there's a lot of different names. Um, and that one weighed, I think it was 5.3 grams. So very small bird. And then after we weigh it, he's going to put it in the bird bag, so that we can put a Motus tag on it. So that's kind of the full process of banding a bird. There's a lot of variation that you'll see at different banding stations. Some don't take a tarsus measurement. There are other measurements you can take. You can take tail measurements. You can take like wing feather measurements, a lot of different things you can do to help you age or sex that bird. But most banding stations will age and sex the bird, take a wing chord measurement, take a fat score sometimes, and take a weight. I mean, that's kind of standard migration monitoring procedures. So the next video, I think this is maybe my last video that I'm showing you, is going to show you the process of putting the actual tag on the bird. These tags are all pre-fitted, so we kind of had a range of sizes that we were using for different size prairie warblers, and we did end up getting kind of like one size that usually fit most prairie warblers. So this is him taking it out of the bag again. And then he's going to attach what looks like this little leg loop harness. So basically, one of the loops goes around one leg. The tag fits over their back. So he's got it over one leg. He's pulling it over the back of the bird. And then the other loop is going to fit around the other leg of the bird. So it's kind of like they're wearing like a little fanny pack on their back. It fits kind of on what we might call the small of the back. On a bird, it's almost certainly different, but fits kind of like, right above their tail feathers. So he's just checking the fit here, checking to see how it's sitting on the bird. You don't want a tag that's too tight. This kind of flipping motion he's doing is verifying whether it's too tight. It should be tight enough that it flips back onto the bird. So when you pull it forward, it flips back. And it shouldn't be so loose that when you flip it over, it stays flipped over. You don't want to be too loose, otherwise it might get caught on something or the bird will lose it very easily. But you don't want it too tight because you don't want it injuring the bird at all, like causing too much abrasion on the feathers or things like that. So there's kind of like this nice medium where we fit the tags, that allows the bird injured but also keeps the tag on fairly securely. And there's been several times where we've recaught birds with a tag from last year on. Often it'll degrade in like a couple of months or 5 months with just general wear on those elastic cords. But we have caught birds with the tag still on. Actually, I was just at Long Point doing some banding, and we caught a whippoorwill that had last year's tag still on. And we checked, the feathering, make sure that there was no damage, and the bird was pretty much totally fine, just had a tag on it. And we removed that tag and reapplied a new tag. So they're not really a problem for the birds. The only thing that we did find in Georgian Bay is there's a lot of spiders in Georgian Bays. So the spider webs could like get caught on, we're not caught on the tags, but you would see spider webs on some of the tags after some time. But largely there's no real issue for the birds. And many birds we saw basically the entire breeding season with their tags still on it. So here's where we tagged. Those gray points, when I pulled up this map, the gray points I believe are from past locations where they were tagging some other birds, but those red dots are where we actually tag the birds. So the go home region is where we focused a lot of our short burst tags. So this kind of area is where many of our shoreburst tags are. Let me use a different color so that it's a bit easier to see. So we had a bunch of shoreburst tags in this area of Go Home, and then a few of these ones were also shoreburst as well. So basically, we kept it close to our operating area because it would be easier to collect the data if we didn't have to boat all the way to Sans Souci or Southern Go Home. Kind of wanted to keep all our shoreburst tags in a close area where we could go and collect the data fairly easily. Then our long burst tags went to places like Sans Souci. There were some that we placed in Go Home, and we kind of scattered them around a little bit more because those ones we weren't rechecking. So it didn't really matter where they were placed as long as they were placed on a prairie warbler in Georgian Bay. So I think we deployed around 6 tags up in Sans Souci and another 9 kind of throughout different locations in Go Home. And a few, I believe, in Cog Machine as well. So a good kind of range of the longbird, it gives us a good kind of number of isotopes to analyze. Like we have some Sans Souci birds, some Go Home birds, some Cog Machine birds. We're not focused on just one small population of them. There was even a 1 or 2 Wawatasi birds. So good kind of a range of their entire breeding population. And then we had a couple, these are kind of the early findings. We're still analyzing some of the data. There's a lot of interesting things we found. Some of the preliminary kind of mock-ups that we've created for some of the territory sizes. But we found the biggest hiccup in the entire research of the prairie warblers was how quickly they arrived on Georgian Bay and how quickly they bred in Georgian Bay. So June is largely the month we think of for bird breeding. That's usually when they're setting up nests, finding mates, laying eggs, fledging young. Prairie warblers, I think of May as the breeding time because we had fledged young by June 15th, which means they would have been on territory building a nest in very early May. So they arrive early. May 7th is when they were first recorded last year. I think they were recorded like May 4th this year. So they arrived very, very early on the bay. And as far as we can tell, they kind of arrive and start breeding. Like they start finding a mate, start setting up a nest, start laying eggs. Because it's about a 20 to 30-day window from the egg being laid and the young being capable of flight. And so if we found ones capable of flight on the 15th of June, that means their nest was started, May 15th to May 20th. When we're talking about breeding birds, we talk about the safe date. So May 24th is like a safe date where we assume that many of the birds that are being found are on their breeding location. This is mainly for the kind of breeding atlas, this assessment of breeding birds in Ontario, but there's probably a good case to making this probably at least a week earlier because of how quickly the birds can get on territory. And this photo is actually a nest of birds that I think we found somewhere around June 10th, I want to say. So already, they have feathers. They're looking like getting pretty close to being fledged and getting pretty close to being able to leave the nest. So very, very rapid breeding, which we weren't expecting. We were expecting, to be able to collect data until mid-July, when in the reality, all our data needed to be collected by like the end of June. There's also the potential for kind of peripheral males. So there was one bird we tagged about a kilometer away from another nest site, and it was singing where we tagged it. Called it in from a different island actually, and it hit the net and we tagged it. And then we found it about a kilometer away at another nest site, and we couldn't understand how we were picking up this bird because it was much farther away, lots of rocks and trees in the way. And it was hanging around a different nest site, silently just kind of being there. So there is a potential that there are peripheral males that are kind of interacting with nest sites. I'm not sure in what way, but it was definitely hanging around a different pair's nest site at the same time that they were, feeding young. So there's some sort of interesting kind of almost territory sharing that we're seeing with some of these males. The other thing we found are the territories are kind of larger than we assumed. We assumed that the territories would be kind of quite small, restricted to kind of where they're singing, but that's often not the case. In fact, the one that we tagged on my cottage regularly crossed water a couple times to go to a different location to sing. So the territories are much larger than we first thought. And the nests are almost always in juniper. Every single nest we found last year was in juniper and in about hip height juniper. So not like shrubby low juniper, like nice mature juniper. I've heard of them nesting in like meadowsweet as well, but every single nest we found last year was in, kind of hip height in juniper, which is clearly juniper plays a big part of their life cycle, if that's kind of really the only place we're finding nests. So this is kind of an actual map of some of the territory that we mocked up. So this is fitting all those points we collected for the birds into this map of what their territory probably is. So the most interesting thing about this to me is how much overlap there is with territory. So we see down, this is in Go Home Bay. There's these two territories overlap frequently. They're basically sharing territory for most of that territory. Same with these ones, a lot of territorial overlap. These ones are, basically in each other's territory. And then the three over here are basically just sharing one large territory. This orange bird is a little bit more out there than the other ones, but the other two birds, the green and the blue bird, are basically overlapping in the territory that they're using, which is a really interesting observation because we might assume that they would be way more territorial about where they're nesting. But there's, potential that maybe they're territorial about just a core range of their territory. So just a small core area, and they just move about the landscape quite easily in the rest of the areas of their territory. In fact, when we were tagging some of these birds, we would find like 3 males in the same location sometimes. So despite them responding really well to playback, there may not be as much kind of territorial fights that we might see, which might explain some of those peripheral males as well. The other thing we found is the territories are about 10 acres in size. So most of them averaged about 10 acres. I think the most interesting one, this orange guy on the left here, or sorry, right, was one of the ones that we tagged at my cottage. And it regularly was singing on the mainland, on an island, and then on another section of mainland. So it was crossing water like twice during its general just moving about the territory. And I thought that water would be a much larger barrier for them. You see it in the yellow one on the left as well, where it's crossing to 2 different islands as part of its just regular moving about the territory. So that was another interesting observation about how willing they are to cross water to move to other areas. So the next thing I'm going to show you is a map that, to be honest, I don't fully understand. I've been talked through this a couple times, but this is the early results from our isotope analysis of the tail feathers. What this map shows is a heavy bias towards the north end of the breeding range. So that dark gray and the yellow is all the breeding locations of prairie warblers. Normally, if you were looking at like a regular warbler, or most birds where there was not a lot of bias towards any part of their breeding range, this whole map would just be varying shades of yellow. So it'd be birds kind of just generally migrating north, finding a suitable territory and breeding there. So they wouldn't necessarily be returning to the same site each year. They would, be kind of just looking for suitable territory, landing there, finding a mate, breeding. This like heavy bias towards the north end of their breeding range means that a large number of them are in that kind of isotope band. Isotope analysis is not like, it's not perfect science. It doesn't say like this is 45 degrees north, this is 40 degrees north. It's towards this area. So this heavy bias towards the north end of the range means that there's probably a good case to be made that many of these birds breeding in Georgian Bay this year are returning from last year. So there may be this subpopulation in Georgian Bay that is returning to Georgian Bay year after year. I think part of this kind of push south, this section in the middle, there was one bird that seemed to have not as similar isotope analysis as the other birds. So there may be still some gene flow between the populations, but there's definitely a strong case to be made that we need to be looking at some other genetics to see if there is a specific population that is returning to Georgian Bay year after year, which is what this map is kind of suggesting. So some of our other early findings, this was one specific bird, and these white dots are different towers that was picked up on. And there seems to be some really large post-breeding dispersal. That means after they finish breeding, they move somewhere else. In cases like sparrows and other warblers, they don't move very far. They might move to a different island. They might move like a little bit. But in this case of this bird, we banded it. We banded it down here. And then on June 23rd, it said, I'm out of here, and went all the way north. And it stuck around in this north one for about a month. So it left June 23rd and stayed up on Sandy Island or somewhere in this area until July 23rd. And then it decided to start migrating south, and it moved down to hit this tower and then moved and hit this tower on its trip south. So there seems to be this quite large post-breeding dispersal where they breed and move quite like far across the landscape. I've several times have talked to cottagers who say, oh, I have prairie warblers, but only in July. And if you're getting a prairie warbler in July, that's quite possibly breeding dispersal or post-breeding dispersal, not actual breeding. So there seems to be this large dispersal. I think one of them went all the way to Collingwood and then decided to come back up to Georgian Bay before it migrated south. It's very interesting to see them move across the landscape so significantly. The birds can leave quite early. So we had ones leave at the start of August. We had ones like kind of fly past our last tower end of August. But there were also still birds passing through like September 10th and 11th. So they have this, potential to leave early, but they also seem to have this quite a large migration window in which they're leaving. So I think our last bird left Go Home Bay around September 11th, which when they're starting to migrate at the beginning of August or middle of August, that's a lot longer than you might see normally in many of our warbler species. So that was another interesting observation that we found. So what's next? I thought with so many prairie warblers, you might like to see a slightly different warbler. This is a pine warbler that we happened to catch in the net while we were banding prairie warblers. Sometimes you do get bycatch, so it flies into the net just because you have it set up. So we banded this pine warbler as well. But we are going to be continuing the project this year. We're deploying around 20 tags. I think it's 19 in total. So we'll be putting some more short burst tags on some birds to get some additional data on their territory sizes, as well as seeing if we can recapture some of the birds we banded last year. So we'll be setting them up in similar sites and seeing if there's a chance that it, kind of when we catch it again, it might be the same bird. And that's going to show some site fidelity if we are recapturing some of the birds we banded last year. And then depending on how many birds we catch or how quickly we catch our birds, we're also looking at potential for post-breeding dispersal studies. So that would be kind of holding back maybe 2 or 3 of our tags and deploying them later in the season, something around June or middle of June, to see how those birds move around like the landscape of Georgian Bay, if there is like, that large push to other sites. So there's also some post-breeding dispersal work that we're looking to include with this year's study, if we have enough tags and can catch enough birds. So I just, before I finished, I wanted to give a quick thank you The project was supported by both the Bailey Fund with Birds Canada, as well as the Bill and Betty Wasserfall Memorial Award from the Ontario Bird Banding Association. In addition, it was supported by donors for our Big Day fundraiser, with matching funds from the Weston Family Foundation, Jackman Foundation, and other private donors. I'm pleased to say that our Big Day fundraiser is continuing this year. The Big Day is slated to be May 18th this year. And you can find out more of that on our website. I'm sure Sarah can post a link in the chat. But it's kind of a fun day. I wake up at midnight or don't sleep, and I bird for 24 hours, and we count as many species in the county of Muskoka, which includes Georgian Bay, as we can in a 24-hour period. Last year, we broke the record with 131 species, and it's quite a fun day. We have a trip report that updates as we see species, so you can follow along all day and see what we're seeing. Just the only warning is if you wake up at 9 o'clock and check our lists, we're often over 100 species by that point, which is kind of a fun realization at 7 a.m. when we think, oh, everyone else is waking up and we've been bird watching for 7 hours. So yeah, Sarah can post a link in the chat to give you a bit more information on that. So now I'd like to open up for questions. Before I do that, I just want to tell a quick story about the cedar waxwing, who I like to put as the question slide because it looks like he's asking a very angry question. This was a cedar waxwing that was flying above one of our prairie warbler nets very, very frequently. And I said, man, wouldn't it be funny if we caught it? And as soon as I said that, it flew directly into the net. And we extracted it and realized just how loudly they scream when they're being extracted. So that's just a little fun story from some of the other interesting things you catch in nets. So I'm happy to answer any questions. You can post them in the chat. Sarah can ask them. And thanks.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Okay, we've got a question already from Janet, but I was going to ask first, before we get to everyone's questions, can you do an impression of a prairie warbler call for us?
Nope, because I'm very bad at doing that. But what I can do is I can pull one up on my phone and put it next to the microphone.
Okay.
So everyone can hear that. That's far better than my garbled attempt at replicating one. So let me just pull one up. Many of you may not know the song, but will probably instantly recognize it. Can you hear that?
Yeah, that came through. Okay, yeah.
It's a very ascending trill.
Okay, thanks. Because it is, for those of you who haven't been aware of it yet, you will hear it once you start listening for it. It's quite common in Georgia. Yeah. Okay, so Janet is asking, do you use your phone for pictures? And do the newborn warblers migrate in August too?
The very good questions. I tend to use I have a camera, but a lot of the kind of bird in hand photos are just taken with my cell phone. It's a little bit annoying to bring a camera with all the banding gear we have to bring. So most of these bird in hand ones are done just with my camera phone. And do the juvenile warblers migrate with the rest of them? That's a really tricky question. I'm not sure. What I can tell you is there seems to be a collection. I've seen this twice now, or maybe 3 times. There seems to be in very early August, this all of a sudden you'll see this grouping of prairie warblers, and it's often juvenile birds. I've seen 6 in a flock or 5 in a flock with a couple other warbler species. I have a sneaking suspicion that the juvenile birds might migrate earlier than the adults. I'm not sure, but there does seem to be this grouping of them early in August. And then often the ones that you see later in the season are adult birds. So I couldn't answer that with any proof, but my anecdotal experience is that the young start migrating somewhere beginning mid-August, quite possibly earlier than the adults are.
Okay. Any other questions for Aaron? looks like that might be it for tonight, Erin. Oh, okay, we've got a couple more. Tom is asking, what is the lifespan of prairie warblers?
That's another good question. I can't answer for prairie warblers. Predation is quite high, so like, you know, most small birds don't have a huge lifespan. It's somewhere like probably average of like 3 to 5 years. Um, we did so when I was banding at Long Point this year, we caught an American tree sparrow that had originally been banded in 2017. So that sparrow was about 7 years old. So the only way we can really figure that out is to be recapturing some of the birds that we banded already. So I'm hoping that's something that we'll be able to like reveal as we get more bands out on birds. I would guess it's somewhere around 5 years, but we also have this tree sparrow that has lived 7 years. So it's tough to give an exact number, but I think we would probably be somewhat surprised in how long some of them can live.
Okay. And Georgia is wondering, does the Georgian Bay Land Trust plan to continue this study for additional years given funding? And if so, how many years would this run?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I think there is a very strong case to be made for this to prairie warblers to be a species at risk in Ontario. One of the densest populations of prairie warblers, breeding prairie warblers that we used to have in Ontario was in Wasaga Beach. That was something like there was like 12 pairs per hectare there. So very dense population of breeding prairie warblers that is now totally extirpated from the area. They don't breed in Wasaga Beach anymore. Or if they do, it's in super, super low numbers. And that's largely due to like large scale cottage development in Wasaga Beach, kind of interrupting their habitat. They clearly have some association with juniper. So removal of juniper is going to cause issues for them. I find that Georgian Bay as a whole has less development as was seen in Wasaga Beach. So I think the basically what I'm trying to get at is the threats to their population are still quite high in Georgian Bay. There's still cottage development. And land clearing happening, so they are under pressure. And originally when they were assessed as species at risk, they were not assessed at risk because they were a stable population in Georgian Bay. We don't know if that's still the case. They were last assessed in 1991. So I think there's far more data we can collect. And it's such an iconic bird for Georgian Bay. It's such a neat bird and like one of the last strongholds for the species in Ontario. So I think, continuing this project for a longer time is of incredible importance because, we want to make sure the population isn't declining. It seems to be stable, at least north of Honey Harbor, but if we don't know what a population decline looks like. We don't actually really have a good assessment of what their true population is. So I would hope that this research would continue into the future so that we can answer some of these additional questions and make sure we know enough about the species that we can protect it in the long term, as opposed to just continuing work for 2 or 3 years, stopping it, and then all of a sudden prairie warblers disappear or decline rapidly 5 years from now, and we're like, why did that happen? So I think it's really important to continue with this, and I'm hoping to continue it for several years in the future.
Okay, awesome. Stephen is wondering, he says, I started to notice prairie warblers about 10 years ago when their song superseded song sparrows in the morning. Are they relatively new to the Georgian Bay area, or have they always been around? And that would be in Cotton Machine, I think.
Yeah, they've been around for quite a while. I think when I was doing some prep work for this research project, the populations were first, like, I don't want to just say discovered, but I think they were first noticed in something like the 1960s. It was like, oh, Georgian Bay has a lot of prairie warblers. If you read some of the historic stuff, a lot of the sites where prairie warblers were recorded have been either eliminated or their population there has been fairly reduced. With Georgian Bay really being the last stronghold. So I think they've been around for quite a while. They've certainly been around for as long as Georgian Bay has been this early successional forest eco type. So I would guess it's been a while, but you know, if you're not paying attention to birdsong, it's not like the most noticeable bird song, I guess. It's not something like the whippoorwill where you hear that at night and you're like, yeah, I know what that is. It's a little bit more, you know, um, it's not quite as vocal or distinctive as some of the other birdsong we have.
Okay. Elizabeth's asking if we plan to publish these results in an academic journal.
Yes, that is the plan. Myself and Andrew will be working on a paper probably at the end of this year that we are looking to publish in an academic journal.
And Tyson is wondering, what would it take for the species to get reassessed? And does new research like this put a lot of pressure on to do so?
I'm not 100% sure. So anyone can write COSEWIC, or which is our federal species at risk and our provincial species at risk, to like create a case to reassess the species. Um, I think this research in combination with some of the recent changes in prairie warbler populations really is a strong case for at least looking at, is the population still stable, or is this something that we need to be reassessing moving into the future? The one thing that I didn't mention that we did find is that the prairie warblers are within 100 meters of the shoreline. You move like 200 meters inland and you don't hear them anymore. They're totally a coastal species. So what we may have thought as tons of habitat for them, when you think they're not using inland forests, they're not using like inland wetlands, they're strictly on the Georgian Bay coast, all of a sudden their like actual habitat decreases fairly substantially. So I think there is a strong case to be made to at least reassess or look at them again. Whether I can, predict what COSEWIC or COSARO might do, I'm not sure, but I do intend to submit kind of report to attempt to get them reassessed.
Okay. Great. I think that is the end of our questions. Thank you so much, Aaron. This was a very informative talk. There will be a recording of this sent out probably tomorrow to everyone who registered. So if there's anything you were hoping to revisit, you will be able to do that. And yes, as Aaron mentioned, we have our big day fundraiser coming up, and we would really appreciate any pledges that anyone's interested in giving towards that. All the funding raised through that goes to support our conservation work, including this bird research. So you can go to the link that I put in the chat, or just go to gblt.org/events and click on the big day, and you can learn more about the event and make your pledge if you like. Last year, as Aaron mentioned, we saw 131 species, and people pledged anywhere from, I think it was 25 cents to a few dollars per species. So you can set your own amount, and we're grateful for any support. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope you all have a great summer, and we will also be posting our summer events listing on our website